Good evening. We're responding to some of the suggestions that have been sent in. And if you've sent a suggestion for our discussion on theology made simple, and it doesn't turn up being discussed for a while, it's just because we have quite a list of them and we're trying to take them in some kind of order. When we finish this whole series, though, we'll likely publish as a small book in a more systematic form, the same discussions transcribed. But somebody had asked me why the Orthodox Church had chosen mystery as opposed to scholasticism. The West went into chose scholasticism. And I think the explanation has to be a little larger than that, because essentially the West adopted scholasticism from the Islamic schools in Andalus in Spain. There are great Islamic academies there based primarily in Aristotle and Aristotelian rationalism. You know, Aristotle was the father of what we would call modern rationalism, or rationalism in general, and certainly a useful tool, particularly in science as it developed, but not so much in the understanding of God and the creation in terms of God's creation. Because many of the things that would seem irrational are integral parts of the human condition. And many of the interactions between God and man would seem irrational from a human perspective. Why, for example, should God forgive us? It might be irrational. Perhaps there should be a law court set up. We should have the Inquisitions and punish people. The Inquisitions were a product of scholasticism. And so let's look at this a little bit differently. First of all, Orthodox theology is existential. Western theology became scholastic. Now, when we talk about existential, it's a big word, so let's describe it a little bit. The Orthodox Church looks at life and our experience with God, our experience with each other, in terms of the actual experience of our daily existence. And that's pretty much what we mean by existentialism. It's how we take responsibility for things and what things we cannot be responsible for, and how we strive to become more responsible. But we base this on actual living experience, together with revelation. And this is what existentialism means: the real experiences of human existence in this world. When we talk about the mystery, we're not talking about mystery in general. What we're saying is there are many things that are a mystery and that we cannot understand and define in any clear, rational, legal way. Now, we find this in human experience, not only in our inability to know the essence of God, but also in modern science itself. It's notable that Niels Bohr, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, said that in physics, we are not trying to understand the essence of nature. We're only trying to discover how much we can know about nature. Well, that's reasonable and logical, and it's what we call apophatic. Now, the word apophatic is another big word, which we hear very often in Orthodox theology. So let's just look at these terms now. First of all, scholasticism derives its name from the schools. The Aristotelian schools, the schools based in the rational thought of Aristotle, both in Muslim Spain and in Western Europe, felt that by the use of reason, you could come to know and understand all things, everything. everything about God, everything about the world, everything about the universe, everything about nature, everything about science, everything about humanity. So the schools began to establish what was and was not, first of all, Roman Catholic, and later Protestant, what was and was not an actual doctrine of the faith, and what was heretical and what was true. But being preoccupied with rationalism or rational thought, the idea was to have reason and faith working together, but little by little the rationalism or reason would push faith a little to the side. Because you're trying to, by reason, understand everything, consequently there was nothing you could actually accept on faith. So the mystery of the faith and our relationship with God were put under a microscope to try to define them in some kind of legal terms, but also to define science and the understanding of nature and the world in some kind of legal terms. And the catastrophe of that was that there were so many things that simply couldn't be known, particularly at the time. Remember, we're speaking of an era when the telescope would be a novelty, and microscopes hadn't been made yet, and if they were, the lenses were very poorly made. So there were so many things that couldn't be known. And yet one wanted to know everything by means of human reason. In the Orthodox world, there was a great pursuit of science as well. We had a number of women who were involved in the sciences in Constantinople and in medicine. But there was a realization that many things are a mystery that cannot be simply solved, and that the means for knowing them didn't necessarily exist at the time, and in some cases might never exist. We accepted mystery in the universe, and above all mystery in the human condition, the human person, and developed what we would call Apathetic Theology. Now, apophatic means that really there are some things we can't know. There are some things we cannot define. We can sometimes say what something is not, but we cannot say what it actually is. Now let's look at, say, the 800s. How many people could have told you that water was composed of hydrogen and oxygen? 2 parts of one, 1 part of the other. So we can say that water is not dry. Water is wet. We could make these sort of, even some adjectives about them, or some adverbs, or verbs. You know, water flows, water runs, water does various things. But nobody could say what water was a mystery. Nobody knew that it was H2O. And very few people knew what sodium chloride was, that you could sprinkle it on your food and make it taste better. Salt was salt. But it was a mystery what it actually was. Well, those things could eventually be discovered, but not by the means that were at hand in those times. So the Orthodox Church simply said, we understand the faith in terms of our relationship with God and with our neighbor. This is an existential thing. It deals with our actual human existence. And this is what we mean by existential at this level. Our actual human existence, as we struggle and try to conform our lives to the gospel, reveals to us these things about our humanity and leads us to understand our humanity better and to try to grasp an even greater understanding of it. But there are mysteries in our human persons. There are mysteries as to why 2 brothers can be so different. There are mysteries to why some families are so beautifully put together and function so well and others don't. We could make up speculations. We could say, oh, well, one family is possessed by demons, the other isn't, or something like that. And yet we have to agree that these things are a mystery. So our existential experience, that is our experience in terms of actual human existence, tells us that when we teach when we preach the gospel, we have to preach it in terms of, and teach it, in terms that human beings in any given culture and society can actually understand. In other words, when we teach the gospel, we have to give it to people in a way that they can actually apply it to their daily lives by understanding in their own terms. For example, if I were to give a sermon in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is agricultural center, I might use agricultural metaphor when preaching the gospel, because Christ uses agricultural metaphor as well, living in an agrarian society. If I used the same expressions in Vancouver, nobody would know what I was talking about. In British Columbia, along the coast, I might rather try to use metaphor dealing with salmon fishing or with deep sea fishing, which is a major part of the economy here. In interior British Columbia and along other parts of the coast, I might use logging metaphor, because logging is the main industry, and it's what people understand. So the metaphor that I use to express things in a sermon would be different in different places, because I am being, in this case, at this level, existential. Now, it's a bigger issue than that. We'll talk about it later. But here, this is the way people exist in their daily lives here and now. And how do they, within terms they understand, take responsibility for things and grow and develop. And yet, things remain a mystery. We cannot know the essence of God. That is a mystery. And it might be a mystery to us why God would bother to love us and care for us and desire our salvation. We can't put that into legal terms, but in the scholastic world they tried to put it in legal terms, and they came up with the horrendous neo-pagan doctrine of atonement, which is probably one of the teachings most responsible for modern atheism. So, you see, this is what happens when you have the scholasticism, where in terms of the school, in terms of rationalism, in terms of the university, in terms of the dialectic of the law court, you want to define everything in very clear legal terms. Whereas we would, in the Orthodox Church, say some things are simply a mystery. We cannot apply human reason and rationalism of Aristotle to them. Sometimes the middle isn't missing. Sometimes we can't argue from the point of the missing or absent middle ground or middle way. We have to argue that precisely there is a middle in the argument, that it's not either or. We cannot say, in terms of the divine, the door is either open or it's closed. It can't be anywhere in between. It's either open or closed. Well, we can't say that about the universe. Matter is either visible or it's not matter, and yet most of the matter of the universe is invisible. We haven't got a clue what it is. We haven't got a clue why it's invisible. We simply know from the effect that it's there. So there are many mysteries. And the Orthodox Church opted to understand that we cannot know everything, and that we cannot dogmatize everything. And to dogmatize everything, to think you know everything, to think that you have infallibility, will render you and your institution and organization cruel and destructive beyond belief. Orthodoxy opted not to do that.